Hey, what's up, everybody? My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and this, for better or worse, is the New Movie Diary, in which I review recent, new, and up-and-coming film releases and attempt to give you the straight facts about them, in my humble opinion. If I sound a little tired coming to you this week, it's because I am. Since Wednesday of last week, I saw a movie in theaters 3 nights in a row, and I'll be real with you, I'm feeling it a little. A lot of driving around, a lot of screwing up my internal clock starting out on Wednesday when I finally got to catch Oppenheimer, which I know it's been out since the 21st of last month, but like I said on the last episode, I wasn't going to be seeing it unless I was able to see it the way God intended in IMAX 70mm, and even though luckily there's a 70mm IMAX equipped theater within an hour of me, as you might expect, screenings have been packed. I was literally trying to grab a ticket last Sunday, and the earliest one I could get without interfering with the double feature I had lined up for this week's episode was at 11:20 p.m. on a Wednesday night, and of course I had to be in a B row right up there at the bottom of that giant screen. Which didn't turn out to be such a bad thing. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about Oppenheimer just because I feel a little late to the discourse here, but I'll say enough to say that it was actually a kind of uncanny and remarkable experience to have in that giant format, because even though it's like this 3-hour biopic, number one, I do want to say that the pacing of Oppenheimer is excellent. I was really kind of shocked by how consistently it maintained a forward momentum, and how by the time I could feel like we were reaching the final stretch of things, I was kind of shocked because I was like, I don't feel like I've been here for 3 hours. I feel like so much has happened, but all of it has happened so quickly, and now I'm kind of feeling a little anxious, not just about how this is all going to wrap up, but how it's going to wrap up, because the pacing of this film is just so fast in this uncanny way that it almost feels like that's part of the point, that any ending is going to be anticlimactic to a certain extent, because there really isn't a firm ending to the story about mankind unlocking the door of his own destruction with the atomic bomb. The formatting of this film in IMAX is also so fascinating because it's got this epic scope, but it's not really an epic action movie. It takes place largely during wartime, but it's not a war film. And so much of the film takes place in these really kind of non-epic environments of parlors and classrooms and boardrooms and laboratories. And the way it's shot by Nolan and the cinematographer Hoyt van Hoytema is so often so focused on close-ups, and not just close-ups, but really this rather signature style of Nolan's where he goes for a very soft focus and a very muted color palette. And so seeing that kind of style of storytelling, and in the context of a movie where so much of it is actually so far removed from the more spectacularly epic parts of the story of the Second World War, seeing it in the format of this gigantic full-framed screen was very affecting, because despite how big and sweeping the format is, the actual content is so uncomfortably close and claustrophobic so much of the time. And I think it works really well in the context of the kind of story Nolan is telling here, which is far from a perfect example of screenwriting. Nolan's main strengths are certainly not in terms of dialogue, at least, and I think Oppenheimer is definitely hampered by this rather cliche style of overly heightened oratory writing we know to expect and rue in historical pictures and biopics. But even so, I think the main thing that impressed me about Oppenheimer was how dialectical it was, about how genuinely and seriously it seemed to challenge what I expect to be a lot of contemporary Americans, especially younger Americans' notions of just the malaise and normality of living in the world created by these men who created these instruments of mass catastrophe. I think far from the accusation in some quarters that the film equivocates on the question of the supposed just war morality of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I think the film is fairly explicit in its framing of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki as awful, inexcusable war crimes. I also love the visual and auditory allusions that Nolan invokes between America on the cusp of the nuclear age and a descent into fascism. Specifically, this image and sound of rhythmic stamping feet that, of course, is underscored by the Jewish Robert J. Oppenheimer's conscientiousness about how he partially justified his participation in the Manhattan Project to himself by the fact that he is Jewish and he wanted to stop the Nazi war machine at any cost. And then just these shame-ridden fantasies that his character starts having about his American audience literally kind of morphing into mirrors of that fascist regime and that mentality of ruling the world and this might makes right mentality. Like, it's one thing to have a mainstream American drama even marginally broach the question to spectators that maybe the United States wasn't a totally morally or ethically unimpeachable heroic actor in the Second World War, to break away even a little from just how heavily propagandized the Second World War is in our historical consciousness and our popular culture. But it's another thing to have a mainstream American drama about this era and its immediate aftermath that is so subversive in its sort of sublimated portrayal of fascism as an ideology and not just some moral condition or monstrosity, where you have Christopher Nolan, of all people, making this movie that is kind of asking mainstream, heavily propagandized American audiences a very simple question, which is that far from being a complete foil of fascism, especially Nazism, from being simply a binary opposing moral force, are there aspects of American ideology and character that bears a creeping symmetry with Nazism? There's definitely some explosive stuff in Oppenheimer, and I'm probably not going to be ranking this one nearly as high as a lot of people are, but I'm on the same page with a lot of people, even as someone who generally really likes and respects much of Nolan's filmography, that this is a really rather shocking and beautiful progression for him as a film artist. And while I would like to go back and review his films up to this point, it certainly feels in the moment like a magnum opus of some kind. There's some wild experimental stuff going on with his writing and direction and editing here, and I'm a little torn on whether or not it has just enough to serve its purposes or maybe narrowly not enough to really push it over the edge into one of this year's true masterpieces, but it's definitely worth the hype. I'm giving this one a 4 out of 5 handily. But that was Wednesday, and even if I don't necessarily know yet if I'm comfortable calling Oppenheimer a true masterpiece, it's probably the closest thing to a masterpiece I saw all of last week, and movies can't all be masterpieces, but they can at least be fun. And guys, when I tell you that when I was picking my double feature for this Thursday, when I tell you I was literally just trying to have a little fun, just trying to have a little good old popcorn with the milk duds mixed in and slushy time at the movies, this Thursday I ended up seeing a double feature of MEG 2, The Trench, obviously the sequel to the 2018 film The Meg, starring Jason Statham and a giant CGI shark, and then The Last Voyage of the Demeter, a very interesting, surprisingly substantially budgeted new adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula, which concerns itself only with adapting the rather brief section of the novel that takes place aboard the ship that is unwittingly transporting the cargo of the villainous Count Dracula. Of course, Meg 2 already came out about a week ago, but I was saving that one because I wasn't necessarily keen on seeing it anyway. There wasn't necessarily anything about the Meg both times I watched it, once in theaters and once again recently before seeing the new one. There was nothing really about it that necessarily made me leap for joy at the idea of seeing a follow-up, but if I was going to see it at all, I knew, knowing that down the road another week The Last Voyage of the Demeter was going to be coming out, that was going to be the opportunity to see it, to have a nicely nautically themed double feature of sci-fi and horror movies. And the theming of this double feature is definitely right, but just jumping into Meg 2, straight off, I might as well just admit, when I originally saw the Meg in September of 2018, I guess I was more or less in the frame of mind to enjoy it for what it was. As a fan of giant monster movies in general, I was just happy being able to see a big, dumb, giant monster movie on the big screen, and the big screen is definitely the proper format for watching anything like the Meg or its sequel, because even back when I saw the original film and enjoyed it, I don't think I could have wholly recommended it, even on the shallow terms of just a goofy popcorn movie. And having rewatched it recently in anticipation of Meg 2, I have to say, for what little the Meg has going for it, it loses a lot in the way of just basic charitable goodwill in the transition from the big screen to the smaller one, and the main reason isn't even the main ones you might expect. The original Meg is an exceedingly poorly written film. The dialogue is terrible and has that sort of textbook affect of what a broad, unserious Hollywood fantasy action movie feels like: lightly comic but never really very funny, tongue-in-cheek without having a shred of wit to it. The film itself is way too long for what it is. John Turteltaub's direction of the film in both the dramatic and action scenes is very flat and one-note. The acting is as terrible as the material the cast is given, and as far as leads in Jason Statham and Li Bingbing, they have absolutely zero chemistry. Any attempt by the movie to stir notions of lightly romantic or sexual tension between them just falls completely flat. But at the end of the day, the real problem with the Meg isn't that it's a big, dumb shark movie with no aspirations to be anything more than that. The main problem is that for a big, dumb shark movie, it's not nearly as dumb as it should be. I think the main thing that sort of struck me about seeing the Meg again was just how incredibly dry the tone of it all was, how the film itself never really reaches for a kind of joyful, self-indulgent absurdity in any department. For all the sort of very tired style of humor about the film, basically that style of humor where the characters in the film are constantly acknowledging the absurdity of what's going on and having, well, that just happened moments. The thing that's so off-putting about the Meg in retrospect is actually how much of it is just kind of played totally dryly, and in some contexts playing an absurd concept dryly is actually great, because you get an interesting ironic contrast between how seriously you play with the drama, or what passes for drama in a big dumb shark movie, and then the content itself. But that only works when the content itself is absurd enough. But the problem with the Meg is that it's both overly confident about treating its subject as self-evidently absurd, but then rarely does anything that is truly absurd, truly off the wall or bizarre. It's stuff we've all come to expect in terms of big, dumb Hollywood fantasy action movies, which is that they're only willing to go so far as to pander to the audience, but not willing to go far enough to push them to a precipice where they might come away saying, man, that movie was really stupid, like really stupid. Like, I'm gonna tell all my friends how stupid it was. And the problem is that when you're not willing to commit to absurdity, when you're not willing to take the risk that your audience will get that absurdity is part of the point, and that absurdity is enhanced when the filmmakers are not constantly telegraphing and winking to you that they're in on the joke, but just try to be as absurd as possible while playing it completely straight. When you're not willing to take that risk, all you come away with is just a dog boring movie. And The Meg is a dog boring movie. It really is quite bad, but it's not bad because of a particular or distinctive badness. It's just bad in the sense of its total resounding mediocrity, even on its own big dumb terms. So when it comes time for The Meg to get a sequel, really the only question in a broader sense is, will it be as bad as the original was? Will it be slightly better than the original? Will it be slightly worse than the original, either in a good or bad bad sense of how it could at least be worse enough to make it more interesting? Or will it just be as definitionally mediocre as the original? And at least for me, I guess the question is, am I going to be going into this with the same sort of low bar charitability that made me rather enjoy the original The Meg when I saw it in theaters? And so am I going to end up being overly charitable to a really dog boring movie that is going to be able to sell all of its narrowly enjoyable qualities on the big screen, but then just squish down to the home video or streaming pipeline like a wet turd, and I'm going to be forced to come back to it at some point when they do a third Big Dumb Shark movie and have to say, again, wow, that was really a lot worse than I remembered it. There's not really a lot to hope for going in here. All the usual suspects are back in terms of the screenwriters. This is once again an adaptation of a book from author Steve Alten's original Pulp series, which I have not read, so there's no point in me sussing out how faithful they are. And this is, once again, technically speaking, an American and Chinese co-production, which is really quite appropriate, and it may be the case that probably the ideal way to watch The Meg and its sequel is not in the English language, but in a Mandarin dub. And I'm not saying that as some sort of xenophobic joke or whatever. It just is what it is. Not only Chinese box office, but Chinese finance, capital investment, and partnership with American media conglomerates is becoming increasingly common in the American film landscape. What sorts of movies perform well at the Chinese box office are big determining factors in what gets produced as far as big international tentpole productions. I'm sure I'm not saying anything that anyone finds nearly so surprising about our current commercial film landscape, but it really must be said that as far as movies that seem like they were just as, if not more so, created in order to appeal to the international market than the national one, I do have to say that The Meg, even for all its mediocrity, it is special to a certain degree in that it does kind of capture that ephemeral, abstract feeling that only a few kinds of American tentpole blockbusters get, where it's not just the feeling that they are mediocre American films, it's that it has this whole strange vibe that goes completely beyond the fact that it prominently features and casts Chinese actors in starring or supporting roles, but really does feel in this strange ephemeral way like it is a product that is synthesizing the bog standard vacant stupidity that is shared by American and Chinese middle class audiences, but that is really so unique in such imperceptible ways. And as far as that idea that the Meg movies are better understood not really as dumb American fantasy action movies, but specifically as dumb American fantasy action movies that are deliberately made by English speakers to be marketed primarily in the idiom of Chinese fantasy action claptrap. I do have to say that Meg 2 The Trench is fascinating to the extent that if the Meg really felt like a smooth brain Chinese fantasy action movie that just happened to be made primarily by English speakers, then Meg 2 is like that on crack. Like, I was watching this movie and I swear to God, I was never really for a moment fully entertained, but I was just vibrating and transcended into this feeling of like, oh man, this is exactly like so many of the big dumb Chinese fantasy action movies I've seen. It is like literally the exact same tone and tact and idiom. And it really is kind of jarring because when The Meg came out, this sort of type of movie, this movie that has this strange synthetic tone and affect of being made primarily for a foreign audience rather than in the spirit of a national one that just happens to have a global hegemony. When The Meg came out, this sort of thing was a lot more common because obviously you had stuff like Transformers Age of Extinction, right? Where Li Bingbing also had a supporting role, and there was this whole media cycle about how the cut that was released in China was literally one where a second unit filmed more scenes with her to give her a bigger part in the Chinese version, right? I'm also thinking of The Great Wall. Remember that, where Matt Damon was fighting dragons or whatever? That was hilarious, right? Because the whole discourse in English-speaking Twitter about that was, ugh, another Hollywood white savior movie, and it turned out, actually, no, it is literally a Chinese-American co-production. This is literally like some juiced-up experiment in pop culture diplomacy between East and West. The point is that just a few years ago, this sort of thing was a lot more common than it is now, because then COVID happened, and now we're in this climate of, despite the fact that Hollywood is going to be just as cynical as ever, Disney editing a gay kiss out of Lightyear or whatever to appease the Chinese censors, whatever. Hollywood is still gonna Hollywood, but in the last few years, there has been just such a hysterical ramping up of anti-Chinese sentiment at both just a general popular level, but also at a level of political consensus and the national security blob and the military-industrial complex, to an extent that it really does feel like there are lots of people in positions of power who are quietly sharpening their sabers for war with China, which would be so awesome and stupid. But the point is that post-COVID, MEG 2 really is the first of these serious Chinese-American co-productions that we've seen, and if the MEG felt like a Chinese mockbuster lampshaded as an American mockbuster, the thing that's most jarring and I guess passively interesting about MEG 2 is that it just feels even more exceptionally like that, where I'm just vibrating with this same sense of being like, I should not be watching this in English. I need to be watching this in a Mandarin dub. It would just make everything gel so much better and just make so much more sense idiomatically. I'm getting a little lost in the weeds here, but it's kind of important to the one real saving grace that something like MEG 2 ends up having from a cultural anthropological perspective, because the movie really only works in some way as a point of interest the more you imagine it as what it appears intended to be, in part at least, which is as this kind of very old school monster movie vision of diplomacy, this classic kind of giant monster B movie, but on modern day blockbuster steroids, where if it's an international co-production, there always has to be some at least implicit theme about international cooperation, particularly among scientists and explorers, crucially portrayed as non-political actors, and where the big baddie is usually, not always, but usually going to be some type of environmental devastator and or a corrupt capitalistic interest. And so Jason Statham and all of his scientist friends who didn't get eaten by a giant shark are back in this one. Paige Kennedy is back, Cliff Curtis is back, Li Bingbing is not back. And this is where it gets a little ghoulish because nobody actually comes out and says it directly. I don't recall, but it's strongly implied that since the last movie, she literally died of COVID. And that's such a gallows image, and it's something that an international co-production of the Chinese and the Americans is gonna have to acknowledge, but it's only kind of really hitting me the idea that this character made it all the way to the end of the last movie, managed to avoid getting eaten by a giant shark or getting interred in some other kind of horrid watery grave, but then it's just, yeah, and she died unceremoniously off-screen of something way less cool. Like, couldn't she have died of, like, a shark attack or something? Couldn't there be like this whole thing where it's like, maybe Jason Statham is all shook up because he's still in the exploration and defending people from giant sharks game, but he's suffered a very personal loss or something? It's weird because for the most part, mainstream movies I've seen in the last few years have been pretty content to just forget COVID ever happened, or if it's worked into the plot, really just not explore it too much as background material or complication. I was not expecting the big dumb shark movie to be the one where it just writes off a major character of the last film and implies that she died of COVID. And again, this is all part of the kind of really particular and weird aura of this movie, as not only a kind of throwback international giant monster movie, but specifically as this late entry in a more recent trend of Chinese action fantasy mockbusters lampshaded as American ones. And I keep getting not much into the plot or anything else because there really isn't much more interesting to talk about than there was in the MEG as far as the plot, certainly not acting, certainly not not the quality of the screenwriting. And so really the only thing to talk about is the extent to which Meg 2 kind of comes off as this veiled allegory for American and Chinese cooperation post-COVID specifically. Look, these are trying and uncertain times. COVID-19 has created the foundation for a lot of paranoia and a lot of cynicism. Anti-Chinese sentiment is pretty strong in the US right now, especially at a political and elite media level. And Hollywood is always going to Hollywood, but it does need to be pointed out that Meg 2 is pretty much the highest profile film since COVID, even though COVID itself is not nearly over, nominally since COVID, to rather directly engage in these themes of Chinese-American cooperation, specifically scientific research and environmental cooperation, and to a certain extent, without ever even saying COVID-19, the movie rather straightforwardly packages its ongoing message to that effect, or rather bracket it in terms of the implicit threat of COVID, not just as a virus, but as like an ideological wrench in the works of the vision that the filmmakers are trying to portray that seems presently outside of Hollywood and international film finance, pretty far from the popular consciousness of what is possible in terms of international cooperation. And there's a good reason to bracket the film in this way, especially when selling it on the American side of things, because the fact is that there are a lot of people in this country presently who don't just think of COVID as a virus originating in China, but who, whether they have a conspiracy theory about it or not, take it as a personal affront, as this clandestine attack on us from China, as China is the reason that my kids couldn't go to school for a year, or China is the reason that my family members died, or China is the reason my business in the restaurant industry failed, or China is the reason I was forced to wear a mask while going to shop at Target like I normally did every week and nothing ever meaningfully changed. As definitionally stupid and vapid as both Meg movies are, the new one is fighting an unconscious uphill battle here against a very generalized kind of ephemeral hostility towards the suggestion of anything Chinese that doesn't really have anything to do with any political or material objections to the Chinese state, but is exclusively bound up in this rather knee-jerk need to blame some abstract other for the fact that, in the grand scheme of things, we were inconvenienced for about a second for our long, boring lives before we just wrote off a little over 1 million people off the ledger and went back to business as usual, despite the fact that COVID, the thing we apparently blame China so uniquely for, still continues to flare up and surge seasonally, and tons of people still continue to die from it. And so what does Meg 2 do? Because to a certain extent, you have to acknowledge COVID. Making a Chinese-American co-production in 2023 that doesn't acknowledge the pandemic virus that a non-insignificant number of Americans are convinced was literally grown in a Wuhan lab. Look, tensions are high. It would be extremely weird if you didn't acknowledge it in the context of this conception of an internationalist sci-fi monster movie that isn't just a throwback to old giant monster and creature features, but is literally like an only slightly outdated specific type of Chinese-American co-production, like Age of Extinction, like The Great Wall. So you have to acknowledge it to a certain extent just to decompress from that tension, but you can't actually acknowledge it too much because nobody wants to be going to see the Big Dumb Big Shark movie and be reminded of the still wildfire pandemic that just keeps working its way through the global community. So you're kind of between a rock and a hard place. And so regardless of whether Meg 2 can be good or not, and trust me, and you probably got the word of mouth already, Meg 2 is not a good movie at all. Regardless of that, you're sort of stuck trying to square the circle on this completely alien type of internationalist cultural product where you're not even quite certain who it's for. Who liked the Meg so much that they're willing to revisit this world and its characters, even ignoring everything else? But it might be a moot point anyway, because of course the sequel is already underperforming, not just nationally, but internationally as well. Even the Chinese have gone a long enough time of their own national film industry producing their own smooth-brained blockbuster fantasy action entertainments in their own cultural idiom. If they go see an American movie, they don't want it to be this weird B monster movie that feels like the lexiconic mutant of two different brands of pandering cultural infantilization bred together into something that, for as much as I can say that the Meg movies feel like big dumb Chinese fantasy action movies lampshaded as American ones, I'm sure there's got to be some Chinese corollary of me just watching this slop and being in the same fugue state of not even really being able to parse just the basic tone and rhythm of it, because it's just like, what even is this? What are we doing? Why do we have this movie? Why is our film industry chasing the great Satan of the West? I've already been talking for so long about Meg 2, or rather talking around the Meg 2, because there really isn't that much to talk about except in just this 1,000-yard stare that you develop as just the gigantic, culturally indecipherable wave of this movie washes over you. That I completely forgot to mention that this is not directed by the original director of the Meg, John Turteltaub. No, this one is directed by a British director named Ben Wheatley. Now, who's Ben Wheatley? Well, Ben Wheatley is this guy who actually has a decent amount of critical acclaim as an independent British director, especially as one of the kind of progenitors of the kind of so-called elevated horror movie. He's more known for much lower budget films that have a very distinctive, often rather experimental style. Some of his better known earlier films are stuff like Down Terrace, Kill List, Sightseers, and especially A Field in England. That was kind of his big elevated horror breakthrough. His films tend to have a really dark sense of humor, tend to be more psychological in their orientation. So there's this additional layer of, what the fuck? What's happening with Meg 2 where you're just like, wait, Ben Wheatley? Ben Wheatley, the Field in England guy, he's directing the sequel to the big dumb shark movie that came out before the pandemic. Ben fucking Wheatley. And I will say this, that there are two main things that make Meg 2 not good, but kind of interestingly bad in a way that the first film wasn't. And the first has to just do with the structure of the film's plot. That subtitle, The Trench, is there for a reason. Much of the movie doesn't actually focus on giant sharks this time. Basically, what happens is that Jason Statham and all of his friends, they're exploring the trench from the previous film, the place where below this thermal layer, there's a whole ecosystem of prehistoric marine life, including the titular megalodon sharks, as well as some other new monsters. They're down there exploring. They discover an illegal rare mineral mining operation that happens to be using stolen proprietary technology created by our heroes. So obviously there's your big capitalist villain and environmental theming, and really most of the movie is not a big dumb big shark movie, but a survival movie that largely takes place like 25,000 miles below the ocean surface. And look, despite the obvious bait and switch, I actually found that change of pace in terms of how the story for this sequel was structured rather interesting. Until I didn't. Again, this is not a film written by geniuses, and I think Meg 2, largely by virtue of Wheatley's direction, does come closer to kind of resolving that tonal problem that I talked about with the Meg initially, where with the original film it was kind of not as dumb as it should have been, but also didn't play things straight in a way that made it nearly entertaining enough in sort of emphasizing the contradiction between how seriously everything is presented and how ridiculous it all is. I think Wheatley really threads that needle about as well as anyone could with this dog script, because the one thing is that whereas the original Meg was just kind of an overly long slog, Meg 2 is so strange because of how slowly paced it ends up being and how understated and dry Wheatley's direction of the character drama, such as there is. It seems that he's really more earnestly invested in this idea of Meg 2 being less of a giant monster movie and being more of a kind of exploratory adventure adventure movie that is more about the characters attempting to survive in this underwater prehistoric world. And while, again, Meg 2 isn't nearly as stupid as it should be to make it all work, because of the way Wheatley approaches his direction of it, he does occasionally kind of crack the nut where every so often something really ridiculous will happen, but it will be played so straight that you sort of get the kind of tongue-in-cheek quality of it, where the absurdity kind of works. Quite frankly, in line with what I described as being the kind of weird, lampshaded Chinese feeling of the Meg movies, I think what Wheatley gets here is that because unlike Turteltaub, his direction is a lot more expressive and stylized in general, but Wheatley, I think, is also much more perceptive and free associative as a director, because he seems to take to heart that not only should this throwback giant monster movie and fantasy adventure movie not do the thing where it's constantly winking at the audience so as to be like, see, we don't take ourselves too seriously, but that it should rather take itself seriously so that it comes off as a more absurd experience. I think he gets that about the sort of throwback he's making, but I think he also might really be keyed into the reality of the fact that, despite the fact that the key creative personnel behind the product are all Western English speakers, the Meg movies really are kind of elaborate, lampshaded Chinese internationalist productions. And so, as this giant monster movie goes into the sort of cliche directions you might expect, environmental emphasis, evil capitalist, and industrial villain, Meg 2 is the most interesting when it just sometimes hits this sweet spot where it almost kind of feels like Wheatley isn't just directing it as a throwback to classic giant monster and creature movies, but he's also directing it as a kind of throwback to classic Soviet science fiction and exploratory movies. So it's sort of like Wheatley is approaching the project with this intent of being like, okay, I'm not going to downplay the Chinese National Association. I'm going to invest in the invocation of that sort of specific cloistered idiom in order to kind of make Meg 2 an homage to a specific kind of propagandistic science fiction adventure from the Cold War era. So it's not just that the film has some cheap, nominal environmentalist theme with a greedy villain who stands in for all the capitalist corruption. It becomes this thing where the characters of Meg 2, the heroes, are literally like this humanitarian, internationalist coalition who represent this utopian ideal of exploration and scientific advancement, and where even the big dumb sharks and monsters aren't the real antagonists of the story, but are just features of nature, and the real villain is capitalism itself as this subversive impediment, as this thing that, as you might expect, directly leads to a lot of sea monsters coming to the surface and wreaking havoc in the last half hour of the movie, which unfortunately basically turns out to be a totally bloated retread of the same exact climax as the original film. That's another funny thing, how both of these movies basically climax in settings that are kind of exclusively there to pander to the Chinese tourist industry, and that's also where we get a bookend to that theme about COVID, where one of the Chinese extras is literally chastising her child for being on her phone and not enjoying her vacation experience fully after being locked down for so long. I'm telling you, this is a movie written primarily by Western English speakers, but that does turn out to be another interesting thing about Meg 2, the way they really double down on the internationalist focus and the depiction of scenes in Mandarin and from the perspective of Chinese characters, and specifically in such a way where, again, it really does seem like the broader metaphor of the film is about the kind of utopian, quasi-socialistic amelioration of tensions between the United States and China. I had neglected to mention that in addition to Li Bingbing's character having died after the last film, it turns out that despite she and Statham having had negative romantic chemistry in the first film, they ostensibly got married. And so even though Li Bingbing's character is dead, her daughter Mei Ying is back. Sophia Kai is also reprising her role here from the previous movie, and now she's literally Jason Statham's adopted daughter. I actually had to look that up. I don't know if I just missed it, but it just didn't seem conveyed very clearly at all that that was supposed to be their relationship, though I guess it just boils down to the fact that Statham has as little chemistry with Sophia Kai as a father as he did with Li Bingbing as a love interest. But the point I'm trying to make here is that they're really going for it, right down to the unorthodox multipolar family in terms of the heroes of the film being this kind of utopian internationalist consortium who have to solve the problems caused by all that naked capitalist greed that is keeping us apart. Look, I've been talking a lot about the Meg too, and that's primarily because my brain has just been cooking with little things that I find fascinating about it at certain points in the moment, but it's still just not a very good film. Script is still dog shit, acting is still bad, chemistry between principal leads is still not there, and while Wheatley's direction is more expressive, there are long stretches of this film and its action set pieces that get to a point where they're kind of cinematically illegible. Very tough to follow, very little in the way of a sense of clear spatial orientation and causality. And at the end of the day, while there's a bunch of stuff that I found more granularly interesting, this is a long, mostly boring movie that still doesn't quite stick the landing on being played straight enough while being absurd enough inherently to make it fun, even as a vapid popcorn spectacle. Thanks for being patient with me, but I'm gonna give this one a charitable 2.5 out of 5, with the caveat that if this is anything like the first Meg with enough distance between myself and it, I'll probably have a much lower opinion in the future. Anyway, let's stop talking about Meg 2. I've spent way too much time talking about Meg 2. This video is already way too long, so let's talk about The Last Voyage of the Demeter. As I mentioned up top, not an official adaptation of Bram Stoker's novel Dracula, but rather only a partial adaptation, a kind of speculative adaptation of just that part of the novel that concerns the surreptitious transportation of Dracula aboard the titular commercial freighter, a project that has basically been in development hell for close to 2 decades now finally being released by Universal, one of 2 revisionist Dracula movies they've released this year following Renfield in April, also now seeming pretty much doomed to the same fate as Renfield in that the movie is financially underperforming pretty significantly, which is unfortunate because while Renfield I haven't seen, but it just looked awful, looked very typical in terms of Universal's handling of their sort of classic monster properties over the last few years, where they can't seem to crack the nut on just making a more straightforward kind of prestige horror film. They've always got to be trying to chase the vogue of some other style of adventure film, or multi-film franchise, or broad self-parodying action comedy in the case of Renfield. Really unfortunate because The Last Voyage of the Demeter, while being a rather eccentric place to take an adaptation of Dracula, or rather part of Dracula, is at least a lot closer to just kind of a straightforward horror or monster movie, but unfortunately, again, just seems kind of doomed to not really capture a contemporary audience. I don't know if maybe waiting until Halloween would have been a better idea rather than pitching Last Voyage as a kind of summer B picture when you've still got Oppenheimer and Barbie and Dead Reckoning really cleaning up at the box office, and now Meg 2 and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles stealing a lot of the bigger budget and more mainstream attention. I'm not sure, though, if there would have been much that could have helped buoy The Last Voyage to find some kind of audience, at least a solid word of mouth, because while I generally have a lot of criticisms of Universal's handling of their prestige horror properties over the last few decades, at the end of the day, I do think there are just 2 nigh insurmountable things that The Last Voyage has working against it, one of which is something that seems to be passing around as a kind of joke on social media, which is that a lot of people just aren't familiar with the novel Dracula, and so they're not really taking the idea of Dracula on a boat seriously. There just doesn't seem to be enough cultural salience at that level for a mainstream audience. Even people who like horror movies to look at a boat Dracula and take it seriously and not just see it as this really out there high concept idea that they can't connect with in any meaningful way. Whereas the other aspect is that I just think Universal keeps falling into this trap of basically chasing the ghost of these intellectual properties that just don't have a lot of contemporary cultural relevance in general, because whether it's a big budget fantasy adventure movie like the Tom Cruise Mummy, or whether it's more of a mid-budget production like Last Voyage of the Demeter, the thing is that the subject monsters of both these films are very old. They're very tied to eras of horror in which the monsters themselves may be iconic, but are no longer broadly iconic in the sense that they are attractive to mainstream audiences who tend to see them more as Halloween costumes more than they do as big icons of horror and popular entertainment. I mean, there certainly aren't actors like Boris Karloff or Bela Lugosi or even Lon Chaney who are like iconically associated with the monster, so audiences aren't expected to connect to just a monster itself. They can connect it to a character actor that can develop that sort of affinity. They don't really have that anymore. And so whatever else I think of Last Voyage, despite how refreshingly different it is from the tone set by something like Renfield from just a few months ago, it just sort of appears to me that it's kind of doomed to failure just because Dracula as a character just doesn't particularly resonate with contemporary audiences. He's too old. He's been done too many times. The variations of him are just sort of seared into the collective consciousness. People don't connect with them as a source of horror, but as rather this white noise constant of popular culture that just comes off as immediately boring and strained in its relevance to most people. And so the chips were really stacked against The Last Voyage from the get-go, which makes it all the more disappointing that the movie itself is actually pretty dang good. This is being directed by Andre Øvredal, the Norwegian filmmaker who made a big splash with his first film, Troll Hunter, in 2010, this very impressive, special effects-heavy, independent found footage fantasy adventure movie, has since had a career that I personally haven't found terribly impressive. His more recent films include Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, based on the Alvin Schwartz Children Horror Stories anthology. Then more recently there was Mortal, this fantasy action and horror thriller that sort of serves as kind of a low-budget horror adjacent twist on contemporary superhero movies, both of which I found pretty terrible, quite boring. Frankly, I haven't really liked an Øvredal film since his sophomore feature, The Autopsy of Jane Doe, in 2016, and even there I have some reservations, but by and large, even when I haven't been terribly impressed by much of the films that Øvredal has directed, I am compelled to admit that he directs them very well. He's a very consummate craftsman, not very original, but definitely very skilled, and especially with the right script, capable of delivering a polished product, especially one that, in the case of The Last Voyage of the Demeter, really requires somebody who can square the circle between a project that satisfies a certain baseline level of popcorn movie slickness, but at the same time gives both the spectacle and drama of the film the right degree of prestige and seriousness to not just make a good popcorn monster movie, but to make, at least marginally so, a smart popcorn monster movie. And as far as Øvredal's filmography goes, I must say The Last Voyage of the Demeter is some of his best work since The Autopsy of Jane Doe, and I'd even hazard to say that I think it's probably his best work. A career highlight definitely for him. Øvredal isn't precisely a stylist or a very in-your-face kind of director, but he certainly has a very dynamic sensibility that works in the favor of The Last Voyage, because despite the fact that so much of the film is contained to a single setting, which is this admittedly pretty impressive, apparently life-size, that is to say, to scale, period accurate, and apparently seaworthy 19th century merchant vessel set, despite the fact that the majority of the movie takes place totally in this one location. Overdahl directs everything with such flair and color, something that was very much lacking in a more stylistically expressive director like Ben Wheatley's work with Meg 2, with a really easy to follow and coherent sense of space and a clear exploration of the setting and the following of the action. And Overdahl's direction of things is not incidental to why The Last Voyage works as well as it does. It's remarkable how, up to a point at least, he's really able to hold our attention and keep us in a decent amount of suspense, despite the fact that from the very outset of the movie, the ending is kind of a foregone conclusion. This is a very fatalistic story in which we kind of know from the outset that more or less everyone on this boat is going to meet a very grim fate indeed. And yet, not only Overdahl's direction kind of helps to successfully exploit that fatalistic tone, but also it must be said that the screenplay for The Last Voyage is quite good. It's not always brilliant, but there is a certain quality of the oratory of the dialogue and the really rather bleak and uncompromisingly dark directions that the story goes in that sometimes even rather takes you out of the movie, because this is one of the increasingly rare horror movies that get made nowadays where there isn't really a cheek of self-awareness or smirking or winking at the audience. Everything is played very straight dramatically, and it turns out to be just as refreshing for the audience as it does for the cast, who really rise to the occasion for some equally impressive performances. I think Liam Cunningham and David Dastmalchian especially shine here. Also, John Briones in a much smaller supporting part. He's fantastic. But in general, everybody in the cast just seems to really acclimate so fluidly to this monster movie that is not written or presented with a single shred of irony, and is rather both written and directed with a degree of prestigious seriousness. A seriousness about taking not only the source material seriously, but really humanizing the characters, and despite the fatalistic context of where it's all going, giving the cast something to work with that doesn't simply boil down to them being bodies that Dracula is going to gruesomely rack up over the course of the movie. In a year where there's been plenty of really dumb fantasy movies that don't really treat their audience with any sort of respect, The Last Voyage is something of a minor gem that I hope through word of mouth will somewhat inspire more people to see it and to not wait until it goes to streaming. And even thinking back now, just a few days ago, I think leading up to doing this review, I was probably a little harder on it than I should have been, not really as appreciative of a lot of the stuff it pulls off or does really well, but it's certainly not a perfect film. And with this being an adaptation of a section of Bram Stoker's Dracula specifically, there is a pretty major gaping flaw in The Last Voyage that just comes down to the fact that its portrayal of Dracula, of this iconic vampire, is just kind of really lame. I just don't like it, and I think it's far from the most interesting direction they could have taken the idea. Because even if nobody in regular life cares about Dracula anymore, if you're making a Dracula movie, even if you're trying to reimagine Dracula somewhat, you've got to be prepared to be the devil's advocate for Dracula. And it just seems like, to me, that the production of this film, for as long as it was gestating, has just basically taken one of the most interesting villains in Gothic horror fiction and simply turned him into a run-of-the-mill Hollywood creature with an incredibly generic design and just not a lot of character to it as a monster. The really funny thing is that The Last Voyage is actually kind of really bad as a Dracula movie, but that if it weren't Dracula, the very thing that is making so many young people and people not familiar with the novel look at the trailers for this movie and laugh like, Dracula on a boat? That's just stupid. That very thing that seems to be hurting it so much financially, though also the very thing that probably made Universal willing to put up the impressive mid-sized budget for this thing, that very thing, if you were to just not make it Dracula, if you were to just make it a similar but altogether completely original creature, maybe even do nothing else to change the setting or the conflict of the story, but just make it its own mysterious, monstrous ghoul, then not only would the movie itself work a lot better, but it probably would have appealed to more people. It probably wouldn't have alienated as many people for whom it's not just that Dracula doesn't resonate as a monster, but it's that specifically they just find the idea of Dracula on a boat absurd. Way back when the original screenwriter, Bragi Shoot Jr., that's a name, was shopping around the spec script for this project in the early aughts, even way back then, this project was basically being described not as Dracula on a boat, but as Alien on a boat, as a claustrophobic creature feature, and not really a Dracula movie. And even while watching the movie, I wasn't even so much thinking of Alien on a boat. I just kept thinking about how some more monster movie trivia way back when there was even supposed to be a prequel to Predator that Fox was developing that was all going to take place in a period setting on a merchant vessel. And there's just a vibe to this film's particular imaginary of Dracula that makes me wonder if there wasn't more Alien than Predator influence than Dracula influence. And look, there's nothing necessarily endemically about the film that is hurt by its presentation of Dracula. There have been plenty of lame movie Draculas, but I do think that there's something to be said for the fact that so many people have been tinkering away at this Dracula movie for so long, and that the result is a Dracula movie where Dracula is the least interesting thing about it. There are plenty of cool aspects of the monster and the set pieces, but the problem is that Dracula in this movie is sometimes cool, but he's never scary or ominous or foreboding. He's just such a superficially generic hunter, and what gets completely neglected by the filmmakers is the potential for Dracula not as this tangible monster, but as this more metaphysical force, this more supernatural entity that has many forms and many ways of manipulating people and bending them to his will and expressing motivations that go beyond just consuming people, and thus making him a subtly interesting character as well as a cool monster. Like, this is a Dracula movie where they have completely forgotten the Count part of Dracula, that he's Count Dracula, that he's not just a monster, he's like a dark overlord. He's supposed to have more complicated motivations and a more strategic, manipulative way of going about things. Instead, it's just this creature that's called Dracula, but there's nothing connecting it to Dracula. And Andre Overdahl would definitely be the guy to make a lame Dracula who's all affectations of being a cool monster, but not actually a scary reimagining of Dracula. Going back to Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, which was produced by Guillermo del Toro, guy is 100% a del Toro protege, and he very much shares with del Toro a monster movie fan's uncritical obsession with the design and the look of monsters, almost as if they're more interested in the physical plastic creation of the creature that you can call a monster just because it's gross or odd or biologically eccentric, but where there's no real depth of monstrosity to it, what's going on behind the design and inside the character of the creature. And what's especially telling about the filmmakers having fumbled the bag on this one is that it's very clear that the design of Dracula in this movie is very much inspired by a specific version of him from the Francis Ford Coppola film from the early 90s. The design is very clearly inspired by the bat monster appearance of Dracula from that film, but that even kind of directly underscores the problem with The Last Voyage by contrast, because more than any other filmmaker, Coppola really got the most out of the intangibility of Dracula, that he is a hideous monster that has very many forms that are all uniquely hideous in their own ways. So he doesn't just show Dracula as a bat monster, but then that bat monster transforms in the shot into a crucifix of rats that then go scurrying away out of the room. Even at a level of cool, that's the whole cool thing about Dracula, is that this intangible force of evil, he can basically take all different kinds of incarnations. He can be bats, he can be a wolf, he can be the mist, or he can be a polite man of society, or a hideous old man, or somewhere in between all of these things. And especially in a movie that takes place entirely on a boat, you could easily imagine something that exploits and gets the most out of that intangibility of a monster like that, where it's like, oh, are these the mists of a cloud movement rolling in, or is that Dracula in the mist? Or are these just rats scurrying around the cargo hull, or is this Dracula spying on and watching us? And you don't even need to lean so far into that. Far from Alien on a boat, you could basically make it more like John Carpenter's The Thing on a boat, where Dracula could be anything and anyone, where you get more out of the way Dracula can bite someone and then possess and control them and bend them to his will, play with elements of paranoia and distrust more. Like, even as just an adaptation of that one section of the book, the fact that they don't even include the bit, despite having the opportunity to do so, where Dracula leaps off the wreck of the Demeter in the form of a giant black feral dog. Now, that's an evocative image. That's a scary idea. Just another generic monster isn't. So it's not just me being pedantic. I really do think I can make a solid case that for everything good that The Last Voyage does, it seriously fumbles the bag in terms of actually delivering on what is promised, which is Dracula on a boat, not just some generic bat monster creature on a boat. There's lots of things to like about The Last Voyage, and again, I really hope more people give it a shot, but horror buffs and Dracula heads need to know that while The Last Voyage of the Demeter is a pretty good movie on its own terms, it is not a very good Dracula movie. And while that may not be as big a deal to others as it was for me, you gotta be coming with more heat when you're making a Dracula movie, because you've both got some real stiff competition in terms of some adaptations of the book, but you also got a real big dustbin of crap that you're risking your own movie getting thrown into. And I'm not throwing The Last Voyage into a big dustbin of crap, but I am only giving it a very modest 3 out of 5, and if I haven't come off as fanatical enough about this point, I would have been prepared to go lower for how poorly it executes its central Dracula concept. Real lost opportunity here, even for everything it gets right. Real failure of imagination for something that's been in development for as long as it has. Anyway, this episode has already gone on for way too long, so I'm gonna sign off. Like, subscribe, bell, yada yada. My name is Ian Garcia, this is Devotional Criticism, and this was the New Movie Diary. I'll catch you guys next time. Are they gone? All right, good. For anybody who stuck around, good on you, because it means you paid attention to the top of the review when I said I saw movies 3 nights in a row, so for staying put, you'll be getting an extra hidden review, although I'm just making sure that it's clear up front that this one comes with a content warning, and that content is COD. COD for conflict of interests. We've already talked about Oppenheimer from Wednesday, my nautical sci-fi horror double feature from Thursday, and now it's time to talk about what I saw this Friday, which was a very special event as this was the first ever premiere of an original independent motion picture, Caddyshack, and the reason this is coming with a COD content warning is because, I'll be fully transparent, there's a slight conflict of interest here, because as someone who at least imagines themselves to be a film critic, I should be diligent about recusing myself from reviewing films by people I know personally, and in this case, this is a film made by some good friends of mine, writer-director Anthony Catanese, and producer and all-around technical collaborator Sarah Casey, the same people who cast me in that last last minute in that music video I was telling you guys about all the way back in May. Here they are from the premiere of their new film, Caddyshack, and Tony and Sarah have been making movies and music videos together for a while now, but last Friday was a bit of a special occasion because Caddyshack has something that they actually began shooting all the way back in 2019, and then of course the pandemic hit, and so they've more or less been plugging away at it, completing visual effects for it and post-production in fits and starts over the intervening few years. But now it's completed. They had a swell little premiere at the Smodcastle Cinemas in Atlantic Highlands, and now Caddyshack is slated for a physical media release in late October of this year. And look, I take questions of conflict of interest very seriously. I don't want to give the impression that I'm biased in favor of a movie just because friends of mine made it, but, you know, I respect Tony a lot, and he was pretty clear that he wanted me to be able to give my honest opinion, and he doesn't really care if the review is good or not. I guess all press is good press, and it's not like anybody's going to care what I have to say about anything anyway. So, Caddyshack. Basically, the premise of Caddyshack is that it's a mix of Caddyshack and Gremlins. There's this private golf course that's overrun by mutated groundhogs, and it's up to a heroic caddy and his love interest who has ulterior motives to stop the reign of gore and terror. The first thing to understand about Caddyshack is that to call it an independent film is kind of already giving an inaccurate representation of it, because even with independent film, there's kind of the impression, for lack of a better way of putting all this, of like a sense of technical competency and a baseline accessibility of the film in terms of its narrative and its intended audience. With what Tony and Sarah do, we're not even talking about independent cinema. We're talking about underground cinema. We're talking about movies that are made pretty much completely outside of not only the commercial mainstream, but also outside of most niche and boutique or alternative markets. These films they make are made on an incredibly low budget with very limited means, very limited personnel, both in terms of numbers and in terms of professional experience, and in a very limited amount of time, where the movie itself becomes basically a private press enterprise, where for the floor for the investors is so low that they have enough confidence in their ability to recoup their investment plus a decent profit purely on the basis of appealing to not even a coherent specialty market, but to basically anybody whose completionism or morbid curiosity in this kind of underground cinema or para-cinema, as some academics would call it, is enough to make these sorts of enterprises profitable. And so partially the reason that I'm not terribly concerned about a conflict of interest when it comes to reviewing a film like Caddyshack is that there's a part of me that feels like even if Richard Brody were to get a hold of this thing, even if a real film critic, not me, were going to come along and give Tony and Sarah's work some attention, the thing is that they would inevitably be compelled to confront the fact that the kinds of movies that Tony and Sarah produce together don't really qualify by any technical or conventional narrative standard. In a weird way, a truly underground film is very much like a truly avant-garde or an experimental work, in that it doesn't exist necessarily to be appraised along standards of conventional quality like a consumer of movies as a commodity would relate to. What these films primarily exist to do is to inhabit a strange realm where standards of good and bad, the way most people understand them, don't necessarily apply, and the point of the movie is simply to exist, and the point of watching it is to experience it in all of its brute, unalloyed address. Like, I guess technically Caddyshack qualifies in some ways as a horror movie, in some ways as a black comedy, but that happens a lot with underground movies, is that they kind of have to prerequisitely qualify in terms of a particular genre, because besides people who already know what they're getting into from their morbid interest in watching really trashy, lowest budget regional genre movies, there's also an element to it where you go the classic exploitationeers route of suckering people in with the promise that what they're about to see is a lot more professional and conventional and a lot more saliently entertaining than it actually is. Like, here's the poster for this movie. Sorry about the damage. I had it rolled up in my back pocket after the premiere, and I was getting pretty drunk at the after party. But, like, here's the poster, and it looks good, right? Even if you're not necessarily the kind of person who's into regional horror and exploitation movies, you could absolutely imagine someone looking at this poster and being like, well, that looks cool. But, you know, here's the hook, here's the line, and here's the movie, and the movie is about as far away from what you imagine looking at the poster as you can get, because, again, classic exploitationeer stuff. The poster is selling you on a movie you're imagining that looks like, for lack of a better way of putting it, like a real movie. But then you see the movie and you're like, they got me good. They really got me good. Those bastards. And that's not to say that watching Caddyshack wasn't in some ways an enjoyable experience, even trying as I may to extricate myself from my personal connection with Tony and Sarah, my conflict of interest in judging it too harshly. But that's already me generally as a person. I like exploitation movies, I like underground cinema, I like the sort of paracinematic experience of watching movies that, regardless of any conventional standard of quality, exist almost entirely outside of the mainstream and really are, for whatever an outsider might say about them, are very much authentic and intuitively made works of artistic expression that, for whatever cynical or exploitative aspects may be endemic to their production and their distribution and marketability, are ultimately works that are motivated simply by the urge to create for its own sake. Because even if you personally can't stand watching a movie like Caddyshack, I guarantee you they are not nearly as much torture to watch as they are to make. As much as you think you may be suffering from Tony and Sarah's lack of conventionally defined competency or economic cynicism, I guarantee you they suffered far more out of the labor of love simply to make something, because the act of creation itself, even when the act of creation leads to something as vulgar and trashy as this, is fundamentally an act of love and the determination to find meaning, especially a meaning as defined on the very margins of society rather than as being defined by a kind of monocultural hegemon that surrounds and envelops us and neuters our ability to imagine and really make anything outside of a mainstream context and outside of a conventional rubric of understanding. And Caddyshack is definitely a vulgar and trashy movie. Tony and Sarah make really trashy and vulgar movies, and while at the Q&A on Friday, Tony kind of downplayed his creative process a bit, part of that vulgarity and trashiness does involve some fairly ham-fisted satire. Caddyshack really is not very much like either Caddyshack or Gremlins than it is more of a trauma-esque satire of Donald Trump. The villainous golf club owner is rather explicitly a stand-in for Trump. The mutant groundhogs are presented as kind of metaphors for undocumented migrants. I generally gravitated to that aspect of the movie more than anything else because, in general, a lot of the experience of Caddyshack was quite painful. I didn't find most of the comedy elements very funny at all, and at the end of the day, in rather classic exploitation film form, Tony and Sarah aren't really working with a budget that allows them to get away with as much gore as they would clearly like. There are at least two instances where they kind of attempt to avoid or cut around the absence of the ability to follow through on a clear setup to a gore effect in a way that's kind of amateurish and a little annoying. And even as far as their previous films, I have to say that I think Tony's direction has been a lot more expressive in the past, with earlier films like Sodomaniac and Girls Just Want to Have Blood. His visual direction hasn't necessarily been very dynamic, but they've certainly demonstrated more of an eye for stark lighting and color choices. In general, the cinematography of Caddyshack is rather flat, and even from an experiential perspective, a lot of Caddyshack is kind of a rough sit-through, although I found some of the key performances to be quite good, particularly Jake Foy as the catty hero, as well as Jim Gordon as the incestuous Trump-esque villain. Honestly, the highlight of Caddy Hack is the stuff that you don't really expect, and that's the music. And I really hope eventually we get an extended play of some of the original songs in this thing, because I'm sorry, don't come to Caddy Hack for the comedy, don't come for the gore, don't come for the acting. You can come for just the general morbid curiosity about a truly underground movie made right in the heart of New Jersey. But most importantly of all, come for some of the original songs, because nothing about Caddy Hack really feels stylistically very close to that kind of general style of 80s slobs versus snobs comedy. But the original music, for the most part, actually feels very period accurate. And besides that, the definite highlight of the movie is a musical number between the leads, Jake Foy and Chrissy Cavallo, called Balls Deep in Love. And when I tell you I was practically levitating when that musical number came on. And that really is the platonic ideal of the experience of an underground movie, where honestly so much of it will be almost kind of deliberately masochistic as an experience, where you're just watching the movie just to watch it and pierce the veil of all this creative energy that lives so repressed and marginalized in all of these little pockets and regions of American society. But then there'll be one or two moments where you're just kind of shocked out of complacency by how much it resonates on a strangely much more accessible level, and you realize, oh, this is actually really well composed and directed. There's a real flair and inspiration here, and that is sadly sort of absent from the rest of the film. But overall, I quite enjoyed it, and it was a unique experience that I had that not a lot of people are going to get to have, of seeing a truly underground movie on the big screen. And even if you can't see it on the big screen, this is absolutely the sort of movie that you guys should be buying on Blu-ray and DVD when it comes out, and projecting on the walls of your various dive bar basements and, you know, independent artistic co-ops, maybe even some of those like walk-in independent cinemas that are practically closets with like 3 rows of 5 folding chairs packed together in front of a digital projector. Yeah, seeing a truly underground movie on a big screen, that alone added so much to just the kind of strange marginal effect of everything, of just kind of surrendering to just this brutal, rough aesthetic stew of it. I think I'll give Caddy Hack a safe 3 out of 5, with the caveat again that this is a definitive underground movie. The scores really don't matter here. But yeah, that's all I had to say about that. Hope you enjoyed this little extra review, this little featurette. Sorry about the conflict of interest, but I'm only human. But yeah, I'll see you guys next time on the New Movie Diary. For real this time.